I'm Louis Foster, the coordinator of the Multiple Family Group Therapy Resource Center. On March the 14th, 1994, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. George H. Orvin, a psychiatrist specializing in the treatment of adolescents. Dr. Orvin is recognized as the father of adolescent multiple family group therapy, and he talks on this videotape about his model of therapy with adolescents, as well as his working with families in multiple family group therapy. George has been doing multiple family group therapy for approximately 30 years, and the videographer and I enjoyed his interview so much that we chose not to edit it in any way, but to allow you to see the unedited version of this interview. Both of us think that you will enjoy it, and I think you'll have fun.
When I do that about the Pope, the man who spent his life tailoring clothes, and when he retired, his tailor's friends made arrangements for him to have an audience with the Pope in Rome. And they flew him over, paid all his expenses, and he had a private audience with the Pope. And this fellow had spent his life doing nothing but making clothes for man. And he was thrilled to be able to meet the Pope. And they came back, all his friends were eager to find out what it was like. And they said to him, "Tell us, Mike, what sort of a man is the Pope?" And he said, "He's a 37 regular." Tailors do that. They see people according to their view of the world. Psychiatrists do that. Right. People in the mental health field do that. We bring a certain bias to our work, and that influences how we think and how we manage to deliver care. So I think it's helpful for people to have some idea about that.
So would you be willing to share how it is that Dr. George Orvin got to where he is today? Maybe a little bit of a resume?
Sure. It's sort of part of the truth in packaging. Yeah, I would sort of alert you to the fact that first of all, I'm a physician. And because of that, I view so much through the eyes of a physician. And I can't help that. I've been trained in medicine. Right. And that's what I'm supposed to do, look at problems as a physician. Secondly, I'm a physician who treats mental and emotional disorders. I'm a psychiatrist. And because of that, that causes me to look at problems as psychiatrists do. On top of that, I'm not just a psychiatrist, but I am an adolescent psychiatrist. Now let's clarify, I mean I'm a psychiatrist who treats the adolescent rather than a psychiatrist who still is an adolescent. I don't mean I'm an adolescent, I mean I'm a psychiatrist who specializes in the treatment of the adolescent. Right. Now all of those things conspire to influence what I think and how I manage the conduct of my career. On top of that, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I'm a grandfather. All of those things have had their influence in shaping the way I view the world. So, having spent 10 years in general practice, it's hard for me to forget all those things that I learned in the bosom of a family that was having some sort of medical problem. Yeah. I found that I was spending a lot of time with families. When I would treat a family in general practice, before I went into psychiatry, I found that periodically I would sort of run behind schedule. And lo and behold, it was always because the patient had some sort of emotional problem, something other than his cut finger. And I would get so engrossed in what was happening in that person's life that I would lose track of my time and run behind schedule. I finally decided the best thing for me to do was to get trained properly. That I was practicing psychiatry without portfolio. That needed the training, so I went back. Closed my practice here in Charleston and went back to the university and spent 3 years studying psychiatry there, and then took another year at the University of London at the Maudsley Hospital and spent a little over a year there, and then came back and joined the faculty at the Medical University. There I taught psychiatry. And I taught
University of Charleston.
in Charleston, here in Charleston, at the Medical University of South Carolina. And I taught adolescent psychiatry. I started in 1962 to practice on the faculty of the university in 1961, actually. In 1967, I limited my practice to the adolescent and was given the opportunity of setting up an all-adolescent inpatient psychiatric service at the Medical University. Now, at that time, there weren't any adolescent psychiatry beds anywhere in the Southeast, anywhere, that were designed just for adolescents, inpatient psychiatric care. There were 11 or 12 other facilities in the entire country that were university-based and dedicated to the treatment of the adolescent, psychiatric treatment of adolescent.
Right.
So we set up that program in the Department of Psychiatry at the Medical University and began an all-adolescent service, 10 beds. 10 beds, that's all. My job at that point was to treat dysfunctional or sick adolescents. But that wasn't the full extent of my job. My job was to treat sick children, but it was also to teach others how to treat sick children,
Right.
which added a dimension to what we were doing that made the job more fun, but enlarged the challenge in that at that time there wasn't much in the way of textbooks about the adolescent. Child psychiatry was fairly well established at that time, and child psychiatry took care of the adolescent when they had to, usually against their wishes. And when I recall flipping through some of the child psychiatry books when I began working with the adolescent, and you go back to the index and look up the word adolescent, and sure enough, they'd have 2 references in the whole book. Juvenile delinquency usually was what it was about. So at that time, there was really nothing to be, nothing that you could really prepare yourself adequately for. So I learned about adolescence groping in the dark. I and my staff began to learn some things about treating the adolescent. And the thing that I learned, I think, first of all and quickest, was that the most powerful recuperative force in the treatment of dysfunctional children is the bosom of that child's family. Now, the family is supposed to do 3 things. The human family is to produce and autonomize children, new recruits for the future. Society looks to the family for that.
Right.
And they look to parents to indoctrinate these replacements and get them ready so that when they're needed, when other parts of society die off, they've got new recruits coming on. So the human family is supposed to create children and autonomize them, raise them up. That's number 1. Number 2, the human family is supposed to provide for the care, the physical safety, and the physical needs of its members. And thirdly, the human family is supposed to stabilize and fulfill the development of the personalities of the parents. That family is the place where children grow, but family is also the place where adults are supposed to grow. And it's in that context that we find dysfunctional children. We find them in families that are struggling to keep their heads above water. And if we're going to understand the child and the problems that he's having, we must of necessity thoroughly understand the context in which that child is struggling. What's going on with this child is a very legitimate question. And what are the barriers that he's encountering? But also, what's going on in that family?
So you are thinking in systems already.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And that is a system. You think of the family as a system. It has its own boundary. It has its own location. It has its way of communication. It has its feedback loops. And it touches on other systems. The educational system, the occupational system, the governmental system, religious system, and other families, other systems. So I think in understanding what's happening with families, we need to have some understanding about what is it that families are supposed to do. And not just really the general responsibilities, but how do families change? What are the things that happen within families? And how do those events influence the growth and development of this particular child? But also, how do those events influence the growth of the people who are taking care of this particular child?
So you might be referencing the individual growth experience of each person in the family as well as the family life cycle.
Yeah, I think that's what I like to call a process of becoming that all of us experience that begins at creation or at birth. And it's a process that goes on. It's psychologic, sociologic, biologic, theologic, educational, and we grow in that process. And we are in the process of becoming who we are going to become and what we are going to become. When you see someone like me, like here I am, I have become. I've reached a point in my life where I've probably done as much growing as I'm supposed to do. I've sort of warned my wife, what you see is what you get. It doesn't go get any better. Maybe no worse, but certainly no better. But that process is going on. And that you are in the process of turning out. Someday you're going to reach the end point of all of the psychologic, sociologic growing that you're now doing. Right. You're going to become who it is you eventually become. Knowing that that's going on has helped me to be abused at times as I view my own growth, but certainly contemplative and thoughtful about, well, now, wait a minute, what's happening? And what impact is this event going to have on me?
That word, you used the word abused. I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
Amused.
Oh, amused. Okay.
Yeah, tickled and sometimes
Okay.
entertained by what's happening to me. And to be able to sort of be objective about that, we struggle through life. We struggle through life. My good clergyman, Sam Cobb, my rector at St. Philip's Church, said to me, George, he said, in this existential experience which we call life, we seem eternally trapped between doing what we should and doing what we must. That it's a struggle, that we're sort of working our way through life. We're sort of problem-solving our way through life and learning our way through life. Right. And all those events have some influence on how that process is progressing. And you need to sort of have an understanding of what's happening with that adolescent. You need to know that there are parts of life where each of us faces specific sort of challenges, and pretty much commonly so as human beings, as fellow human beings. The adolescent at age 12 to 13 begins to develop into an adult. He wants to become an adult. That's part of it. The other part that's just as tough is not only becoming an adult, but stop being a child. Right. You've got to stop being a child. And you and I, working as helpers, sometimes stumble in our efforts to help the adolescent if we somehow or other don't recognize that he's trying to become an adult. He's offended. If somehow or other we treat him as if he's still a child, he's outraged. In fact, he'll do things to his own disadvantage to prove to you that you can't make me, so there. That is, he's struggling to become an adult, but struggling even harder to stop being a child. And what he has to do at age 12 to 13, he's got about 3 major hurdles. You have to start thinking about your parents differently. You have to stop seeing them as mythologic giants so that you can stop thinking of yourself as a helpless little child. Now, one of the ways that you stop thinking about your parents as giants is to cut them down to size. Cut the legs off. Right. And show them they can't make you do anything you don't want to do. Adolescents run into problems doing that. 35 to 40-year-old people run into problems when it's happening to them through one of their children. Has this child beginning to demythologize his parent, and has the parent, what's happening to him? He too is struggling. What happens to people around age 40? Huh? You know, you begin to add up the score. Right. You begin to recognize that there are probably fewer tomorrows than there are yesterdays. You begin to come to terms with your dreams and your hopes, your ambitions, your options narrow down. So that when that adolescent is struggling to disabuse himself of this view of his wondrous, wonderful, all-powerful parents, those poor folks are struggling with their own problems, mom and dad. A 40-year-old mother is undergoing some changes. Right. Her role in life is changing. Her reproductivity is about to come to an end when all of a sudden, right under her nose, the reproductivity of her 14-year-old daughter blossoms. Most mothers celebrate that development in their child.
That's one of the few rites of passages
Yes.
that we have in this society.
That's right. But it says something to Mother. And the contrast stings a little bit. As she sees the beginning of creative capacity in this child, it reminds her that hers is on the wane. Now, you see, those are things that are part of this process of becoming. Those are the sort of things that influence the psychologic status and equanimity of parents as the children are struggling to become adults. So they have to change their view of their parents. Two, they have to try to find out who they are. As young adolescents, we struggle to flesh out some sort of identity of what sort of person we are. Thirdly, we have to find out what it's like to be a man and to be a woman. That is, we have to sort of evolve a gender identity, a gender-ness. All of that creates ferment within the family system. Depending on how well those two adults are getting along, and depending on how well they comprehend what's happening, and depending on their own psychological intactness, they're going to respond to what this adolescent child is trying to do, and they are either going to help it or hinder it. So that when you and I see an adolescent who's struggling with some sort of difficulty, we scratch our heads and wonder, what is it that's happening to this child? And we'll always be ill-informed until we find out what else is happening at home.
Right.
Get hold of that family. So as I had these children that I was treating, I said to the parents, you must come and help me. You have to take part. Well, doctor, he's really the problem. We want to do whatever we can to help him. And my position has always been, you can't do that. You got to help me, help somebody you love. So that I would demand that the family come.
So if I'm on the telephone with you and my son is with you and I didn't come at the admission, would you pick up the phone and give me a call?
Well, I tell you what, I wouldn't evaluate him.
Okay, so parents would have to be there.
I wouldn't evaluate him. And if you're not that worried about him, neither am I.
Good point.
That sounds sort of calloused. But I think in some ways we become ambiguous about what we tell our families, because I think some of us understand that we really ought to have the family involved, but we aren't afraid they won't come. We're afraid they will. And then what am I going to do? My goodness, how am I going to manage these? I don't know. So we collude at an unconscious level to avoid the parents and avoid the family. And when the family says, well, I can't make it on Fridays, well, all right, we'll do the best we can without you then, which really gives us an excuse for failing.
Right.
And when we fail, it's going to be your fault because you didn't come. But we both collude in that. And I think up front, one needs to be able to say, well, tell you what, if you're not interested in coming, some people come too soon, some people come too late, but some come too soon. And you folks aren't ready for help yet. When you're ready, get in touch with me. Because I think it has to be some understanding that if you are going to allow illness to remain encapsulated within the family system, you're not going to produce health in any other part. And I've seen healthy individuals live in families that were maladaptive and and dysfunctional, but it's virtually impossible to really take a young adolescent and treat him without some sort of participation by his family.
So for the Department of Social Workers, social worker who sees a poor child who has a parents who may be not as educated as you and me, and they aren't as available as what we might find in a middle-class family, if this child were to come and get help and treatment, would that make any difference in this child's life if, for example, the parents wouldn't come?
Well, it might, you know, in some ways. We sometimes have to strike deals that we don't particularly like, and sometimes you end up doing the best you can. But I think in some ways we are accustomed to saying, well, those people don't care about their children. Those people don't care about their children. Now, I've dealt with all 5 socioeconomic classes, the richest and the poorest, the least educated and the PhDs and the MDs. I've dealt with the full spectrum. And I've found that a lot of times the folks who have a severely dysfunctional child are doing about the best they can. And what happens is that child gets into some sort of trouble, and the police get him and take him home and knock on the door and get mama and say, here, we caught him breaking windows, throwing rocks at cars. Make him stop, do something. Do what? This poor woman, 9 chances out of 10, is madly treading water with her nose just above the surface.
Working to survive.
The last thing she needs is one more wave. And somebody brings her the child and says, do something, and she says, do what? We don't know, but do something. Again and again, my experience was when I would say to that mother, you are and you will come, because I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you and I'm going to help your child. There is hope. Something can be done, and things will get better. Many of them breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, somebody is going to help me.
Right.
And I think we need to have some sort of understanding. I think all parents love their children. All parents love their children for a very simple reason. You can't help it. Now, not all parents are good parents. Sometimes loving them isn't enough. You've got to have some other skills too and be able to do some other things. But I think it must be taken as a given that this child's parents are not really trying to make his life miserable. They really aren't trying to make things worse. They may be doing that, but usually it's because they think the wrong thing is the right thing.
So it's not what they don't know, it's what they know that's not true.
Well, that's true. That's true. And you know, that it's easy to do the right thing. When the choice is between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, we all do the right thing. But what do you do when the choice is between the wrong thing and the wrong thing? Then what do? You do the best you can. In life.
An example of that might be the struggle that parents are having today with adolescents who smoke cigarettes.
Oh, certainly. Or doing some of the other things that they're doing. You know, you are limited as to what you can do if you've got all the skills. Life deals us a hand of cards. And those hands aren't always ace, kings, queens, and jacks. For a lot of folks, that hand has some 2s and 3s and a couple of jokers.
Right.
And that's the hand they've got, and that's the hand they've got to play. I've had people who just didn't have a high education, And boy, they were doing the best they could. They were making some bad mistakes. These are people who had maybe ill health, a number of problems that they had. But almost all of them were trying.
You know, when an adolescent has a parent that he has to overcome that myth of parent with, I think that is a natural part of that growth that I think I'm hearing you say. Yes. What about the adolescent or child who doesn't have a parent or doesn't have a myth?
Well, you know, I think almost every child has somebody, has a something. And if you look, and if you'll be creative and innovative about that, I would always insist that the child's family come and take part. Sometimes there was no family. Right. But I almost always found a social worker that liked this child in particular, or an uncle, or an aunt, or a grandmother, or grandfather. And if I worked at it, I could get somebody who would come and be an advocate for this child. Right. If not a real mama or daddy, an advocate.
Do we move from one myth to the next myth?
Well, I think what we need very much is to sort of foster a better impression of who we are and what we are with ourselves. You see, when we started life, we very much are at the mercy of fate and the elements. A newborn child laid on a shelf somewhere for 2 weeks. When you go back, that child's going to be dead. A child needs immediate care because it's so vulnerable. That child, as it begins to develop some sense of the world around him, needs to believe that he has some protection. Somebody cares enough to take care of me. If that infant and that little child really understood how dangerous this world was and how vulnerable he is or she is, no psychological growth could take place. The child would spend its time in constant terror. So, the human mind is a wonderful instrument. It projects onto these people called parents power and knowledge that no human being could possibly possess. My dad's the strongest man in the world. My dad could beat your dad. My mom's the most wonderful woman in the world. She won't let anything happen to me. Those are the things we need to believe so that we can go blissfully about the business of being a child.
So if we believe the system has power, then the system has power.
That's right. But when we reach adolescence, we're beginning to become an adult. And if we go into adulthood believing that mama and daddy are these mythologic giants, then we're going to continue to believe that we are helpless, vulnerable little weaklings. So we have to disabuse ourselves of the belief that mom and dad are all powerful so that we can get rid of the belief that we are totally helpless. So you see, it's shrugging off an encumbrance.
So it's shedding a system of denial.
Well, yes. And it's a matter of beginning to no longer need external security, beginning to provide our own security in preparation for ultimately becoming a provider of security for others. And the trip from consumer of security to provider of security is neither quick, smooth, nor direct. That is part of the process of becoming an adult, is shedding this belief that somehow or other I'm helpless.
So you're saying we move from dependency to interdependence.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We must begin to surrender that dependence. And we finally surrender, I think, the last little bit of symbolic dependence when our last parent dies.
And we become an orphan.
I had a 45-year-old lady say to me, her mother just died. She said, for the first time in my life, I'm no longer somebody's little girl. You become an adult. So that's part of what that adolescent is doing, is beginning to take unto himself a view of himself as competent and capable of taking care of himself. And he must, in order to do that, he must get rid of some childish beliefs. Now, when he begins to shed this encumbrance, it's helpful if those who have been providing him with his protection understand what's happening and permit it, and if possible, even help it. At least try to not absolutely thwart it.
So you're saying be careful what battles you choose to win with your adolescence.
Although you have to fight, yes.
Or
To fight. And let me go one step further. The parent is going to respond to that threat of the disruption of the family, because when that first child leaves, that's the first harbinger of the ultimate death of the family. Families get born, families have a childhood, families even have an adolescence, families mature, families grow up, families die.
Or parents get divorced and families die prematurely.
That's true. So that as that adolescent begins to struggle against the ties of the family, those parents need to understand what's happening. And they're going to respond to his efforts depending upon what's happening between the two of them. If there's one thing a parent can do to ensure some sort of psychological health for their child, it isn't so much what you tell them to do and not do. What matters most of all is how you and I, as a man and a woman, as a mother and a father, treat one another.
So the most important relationship in a family is the husband and wife relationship.
Exactly right. And we begin to deceive and to betray our children when first we believe that the parent-child relationship transcends the husband-wife. That's the foundation of the family. That's what is going to help this child get through. Because you see, for a man and a woman, they've come together and they've put two processes of becoming together. Each is influencing the other. And my wife has influenced how I've turned out. I've influenced how she has turned out. But each of us has been in the process of turning out and becoming whatever it is we're going to become. So that these two processes of becoming are happening. One of the things that influences those processes is the introduction of a child into that family system. Now, if the two parents can meet the needs of each other, children will prosper more. For when one parent fails to meet the needs of the other, that parent reaches across the generational boundary and involves himself or herself in a need-fulfilling relationship with one of the children. And if that relationship is the only thing mother has going, if she no longer feels valued as a woman and as a wife, if all she's got left is mother, she's going to be loath to give it up quickly or easily. And as that child begins to move away from home, that really means the end of a need-fulfilling relationship. And unwittingly and unknowingly, mother might very well thwart this child's move toward autonomy, not understanding why. That happens less frequently when that woman is valued as an individual, is valued as a woman, is valued as a wife, and valued as a mother. And sometimes being mother feels so good that women tend to discount the value of just being a human being, the value of being a special kind of human being, a female human being, and the special value of being a wife.
So if mother gets caught in that role as mother and doesn't develop other relationships and other roles in her life, then when it comes time for the kids to be launched from home,
It's more difficult.
it's more difficult.
It's more difficult.
So it's possible that the kids will stay so that mom will have meaning and definition to her
Yes.
life.
Yes. And mother won't do that intentionally and knowingly. Few women want to cripple their children. None. But that does happen. It happens to good people that don't understand what's happening.
So if mom is really that dependent on that one role in her life, her marital relationship hasn't been nurtured and developed.
Absolutely. So one of the first things I can do to help an adolescent is to get that child's mother and father to like one another. I've never had to testify in a custody case where the child's parents took care of one another.
So how do you get mothers and fathers to like each other as husband and wife?
Gradually, cautiously, skillfully. And first of all, understandingly, that first of all, you've got to really believe that somehow or other that's a valuable relationship. Now, I've seen marriages fail, and I've seen marriages die because of divorce or death. And I've seen a family raised by one parent and that one parent do a marvelous job. But somehow or other, that parent has to be able to find something in his life or her life that helps them feel good about themselves, so that they aren't totally dependent on that child's presence in order to continue feeling good about themselves. That single mother, single father, or married couple, I want those folks to find some meaning in their lives.
So if mom is that attached to the daughter, she's in the middle of a process addiction. She doesn't really have contact with who she is, and so the objective might be to get her to look inward at herself and begin to discover the unique human that she is and love her.
And to value herself, to put some value on herself. That you know, the Shakespeare says, "'Tis one thing worse than self-love to self-hate." So I think we need to not be narcissistic about ourselves, but I think we need to have some value for ourselves, some respect of ourselves.
So what I've come to know in my own experience in life is that I have learned to like myself based on the feedback I've gotten from others about who I am.
Yes.
So their reaction to my personality
Yes.
is important in me knowing who I am.
Yes.
That makes us a social being.
That's right.
And I understand that back in 1967, when you put families together in multiple family therapy group, that one of the significant impacts that this particular approach to helping families is that social approach. Is that what you found?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I sort of fell into family therapy. I didn't know anything about family therapy. Nobody else did. Only one or two other people in the entire world were doing anything like that. Peter LeCoeur up in, I think, Connecticut or Vermont, was bringing in families of adult schizophrenic patients. I didn't know he was doing that. But when I organized the adolescent inpatient service, I had 10 beds and 10 children. And we notified those children's parents that we were going to have an all-adolescent service. And they came to learn some things about what that service would be like. I got them all together in a room a little bit larger than this, and on a Friday afternoon, at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I spent an hour telling them what they could expect. They sat around in chairs, and I sort of explained things to them. And the hour was up, and they were ready to go take their children out for some leave time, and I hadn't completed all I wanted to tell them, so I said, we'll meet again next Friday, and I'll finish up. So the next Friday, we met again, and I was holding forth with some ideas about what we were doing and what the adolescent service was going to be like. And I made a statement. Oh, the parents were sitting around, the children were sitting there. And I made a statement, and I said, you know, all parents love their children. One of the fathers snatched off his glasses and said, well, let me tell you something. If I've got to come here every week and listen to garbage like that, count me out. I don't want any part of this silly thing. And got up, walked up, slammed the door behind him. Well, there was a silence. Some nervous clearing of throats. I was hard to believe, a loss for words. But I managed to finish it up and said, we'll, to the group, I said, we'll meet one more time. Next Friday will be the last. So the next Friday week, we gathered together again. Lo and behold, here was the father of that boy that I was, one that had stormed out, the man who had stormed out. And I began to sort of give my little explanation to the families about what we were going to be doing. And he said, wait a minute, before you get started, he said, I've got to apologize. And he said, I'm sorry that I said what I said, and I'm embarrassed the way I behaved, and I want you, and I want to apologize to all of you here, and I hope you'll sort of forgive me for that. And I started to say something, and he said, you know, he said, when I was a little boy, my father abandoned me and my mother when I was 7 years of age. When my mother and I lived together for a year and she died, I was taken by members of her family and his family, and I spent the rest of my childhood going from pillar to post. And he said it was terrible. It was awful. And he said, he began to weep. He began to shed tears about it. One of the mothers in the group said, well, now, wait a minute. Hold on, Mr. Smith. Let me tell you, you know, you sound a good bit like my childhood, except that I was a little bit older when it happened to me, and I had the same kind of experiences until my maternal aunt offered to take me. And oh, she talked to him, and he listened to her. Another parent chimed in and offered some advice. And I was standing there listening to what was happening and watching the interaction between this distressed man and these comforting people. It suddenly struck me, my Lord, what a powerful, powerful instrument this is. We've got something here valuable. We finished up that session in May of 1989, after 28 years of doing that. I was still holding that Friday afternoon session, treating families. Because what we had done, we had created a family of families. And you see, a family really is a psychological support system designed to sustain its members during periods of adversity. Think about that. A psychological support system designed to sustain its members during periods of adversity. home is where the wound is healed, the balm applied. And here I had a system of systems, a group of families, and they were applying the balm, that they were helping to heal all these wounds. Someone has said that marriage itself is an attempt at healing. That we get married for various reasons, and a lot of times we get married to make life better. And that now I'm going to get married, everything will be all right. But here was these families come together. And I quickly saw that this was something that was very powerful. I could get Mr. Jones to talk to Billy Brown, and the kids would, families would sit in chairs, and the room wasn't big enough. I never wanted a room that's big enough. Don't ever do multifamily room in a room that's big enough.
How come?
Don't ever have a party in a room that's too big. Make people sit close to one another. Make them touch one another. Bring them together. Don't scatter them out. You don't want to have to. Do what you can to enhance the intimacy of that experience. And so I never would have enough room or enough chairs. And the kids would come in and flop on the floor, and the parents would sit in the chairs, and I would conduct group therapy for 50 people. 10 kids, 10 moms, 10 dads, 10 brothers, 10 sisters, an occasional uncle, an odd aunt, a grandmother, and grandfather. We would do multifamily group for an hour, once a week. And I could get Mr. Jones to talk to Billy Brown. And Billy Brown could not say, there goes my old man again, treating me like a little boy. You short-circuit the dependency issue. Mr. Jones can say things to Billy Brown that Mr. Brown has already said. And it went in one ear and out the other.
Right.
Or that his son had to oppose to prove that he wasn't Daddy's little boy anymore. And I've had men in my group, fathers in my group, listen to a new arrival. Well, yes, we're here and we're unhappy, or our daughter has been doing this and doing that and doing the other, and my wife and I are just worried to death. We want to do something to get her straightened out, and so on and so on. And I'd have an old veteran of the multifamily group sitting in there, and he'd start shaking his head, and he'd say, you know, Mr. Smith, you sound a whole lot like me. What? Yeah, you sure do. I brought my daughter in here 6 months ago. I haven't come to this thing ever since then. And I said the same things that you were saying. I was just here to see about helping my daughter. And he said, you're going to find out that you're going to help more than your daughter. And you're going to find out that you can benefit from what's happening here. And let me tell you what's happened in my family with me and my wife. And then he would talk and help this newcomer understand that we all are struggling.
So he could see where he came from, and the newcomer had a place to go.
That's right. That's right. And we always, when we had a family that would leave at the end of the treatment and go home, take their child and go home, we made them come back for 6 more sessions, because it's different back there than it is in this sheltered harbor. And we want people here to see that you do get well, and someday you do leave, and sort of they could come back and offer some encouragement.
So that was a continuing care part of your plan.
That's right. And not only that, as they were struggling to make their adjustment back in the real world, they could file in their mind, well, I want to talk about this when we go to multifamily group next week, by golly. She did this and he did that, and I'm going to see what the rest of the group. And they would. They'd come and they'd bring up circumstances that had arisen in their home, and we'd talk about that. So in the multifamily group, a couple of things that are important to sort of remember. And one of my favorite rules is nobody has to talk. You don't have to talk. You have to come. You don't have to talk. It's hard to talk. People freeze up.
Right.
And a lot of times if you don't have to, it's a lot easier. So sometimes one group member would say, "What's the matter with you? You never say anything. You ought to be contributing something." Because sometimes that particular person will be helpful 3 months from now by saying just 1 or 2 words. So that in a multifamily group, I tried to avoid the suggestion that you've got to contribute a certain number of words each time. Secondly, you have to kind of use yourself as a therapist and lend some of your strength to this one, then to that one, then to the other one, then to that one. When I began my training, my supervisor helped me to learn about psychiatry, and that was in the late 50s. We weren't doing couples therapy, family therapy, marital, any of that back then. But I had a patient who was depressed. And we were in the hospital, we were treating her, and she had talked to me about the problem she was having with her husband. So I told my supervisor, I said, "I'm going to call the husband, I'm going to get him in, and the 3 of us are going to sit down and talk." He said, "Whoop, don't do that." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "If you try to do therapy with your patient and you bring in her husband, you're not going to do any therapy. You're not going to be a therapist. You're going to end up as a referee." And that made a little bit of sense. I understood that, but I said, "But I'm going to do it anyhow." And I went ahead and did it. And he was right. They were really going at one another. And I thought about, here I am refereeing. But it struck me that referees are good. And the one thing a referee must do is make sure he isn't on one side all the time.
Right.
He needs to blow the whistle when the blue team gets off. He needs to blow the whistle when the red team is off base. So as a therapist, I began to develop that skill to be able to have this person angry and upset, and to keep this person from terrorizing this one, but to help this one understand some of the things, so that at that particular time we weren't doing anything like multifamily group.
Right.
So as a therapist, and I did that for 30 years, running a multifamily group, one needs to use one's position as that powerful figure to bring some protection and to strike a posture of understanding. One of the parents, listening to things we were talking about in the early days, was sitting there wearing sunshades in the group, and he pulled them off and looked at me and said, "You know, that's it. You're always on the side of these kids. You never think about us. You never think about..." Giving me a hard time about it. That didn't sound like good news to me. It didn't make me feel real good, but I stopped and thought, this man needs to be able to say some things. I then realized he wasn't going to jump up and come hit me. So I helped him. And I said to him, "You know, I think maybe you're right. We probably make some of the same mistakes y'all made. You know, they're important to us. And sometimes we get so caught up in their problem that maybe we